Sequels where you don't play as the staple main character are cringe. Over the course of a game or two, you've grown accustomed to the quirks and personality of the main character, slowly growing to like them, eventually downloading their personality. Then a sequel comes along and you find yourself playing as someone else. Many of my favourite series have fallen victim to this. Oh, you like this guy? Bang, different character. Bang, different character. Bang, different character. Even my beloved Dead Rising has suffered from this affliction. Oh, a Dead Rising sequel. I can't wait to see what wacky hijinks Frank gets himself into.
Oh no, this can't be.
Who is this loving father? I want my sarcastic journalist back. I'm joking. Obviously Chuck himself is a great protagonist, and the game kind of makes you forget about Frank for its duration. But there was someone who clearly couldn't get over this change of hero, and that was Capcom. Capcom did not like Blue Castle Games changing up the protagonist, so much so that they took over Blue Castle Games and forced them to remake Dead Rising 2 and make Frank the main protagonist. Dead Rising 2, off the record, acts as a reimagining / ultimate edition of the second game, tweaking certain game mechanics, adding a new location, new weapons, new characters, and a new plot, kind of. Who knew that putting Frank West as the lead character of this game would change so much? A game just changing its protagonist and nothing else wouldn't really be worth it. It would be like a Mario game replacing Mario with Luigi. That just wouldn't fly. Like an overused multiverse plot, Frank's inclusion causes certain events and fates of certain characters to change. But of course there's so much different with this game that there's no way you could consider it canon. It's a fun what-if scenario, and I wish more developers would do stuff like this. Swap out a character and see what could be different. It kind of reads like a dodgy fanfic, but with more cool changes and less NSFW. Now some people may think this is lazy from Capcom. Oh, that's original, just give us the same game and have Frank replace Chuck. But you'd be surprised how much actually gets changed by Frank being the leading man instead of Chuck. The original Dead Rising 2 puts Chuck at the forefront of the story. Unlike the first Dead Rising where Frank was someone looking into the story, Chuck was the reason for the story. Him being framed was the main factor as to why the story starts, and his subsequent mission to clear his name pushes the narrative forward. It immediately makes you sympathise with his character. He's just a normal single dad whose wife died tragically and is down on his luck, trying to make some money by riding a bike. He gets laughed at, called the T word that I'm not allowed to say or I'll get demonetized for life, and he has a daughter who needs Zombrex. It's some pretty heavy stuff, and off the record initially feels like it's going to follow the same sort of plot. The intro cutscene gives us some insight into Frank's character. Set 5 years after the events of Willamette, Frank achieved some level of celebrity after uncovering what happened at the mall, even managing to land his own TV show.
And things were good. Real good.
Until they weren't. Frank quickly fell into obscurity after people got bored of him and his zombie stories, and now with nothing left to lose, holy shit, this guy's built like a brick shithouse. All that orange juice must have been laced with steroids. He turns to terror as reality as a last-ditch effort to revive his washed-up career, so he dons a skimpy wrestling outfit and gets to some good old-fashioned zombie killing. This is when you start to think that Frank will get set up in the same way Chuck did, and it makes even more sense if you think about it. Frank is a washed-up celebrity who no one appreciates for his efforts in Willamette, so of course he'd want revenge by fabricating a new outbreak and pulling the strings from behind the scenes, making himself look like the hero once again, whilst being the main villain of the story. And all of this doesn't happen because TK pays Brandon the hippie waster to open the zombie pens instead. Frank overhears the whole thing and takes some photos. This single interaction lets the player know 3 things straight off the bat. Some of the events in the story won't be the same, certain characters have been tweaked, and you can take photos again. Another strange inclusion is that Chuck still appears to exist in this universe, shown by these posters. Perhaps it's just a fun little nod by the developers acknowledging Chuck in a funny way, or maybe it's pointing towards something more sinister. Ah well, guess we'll have to wait and see. Then the outbreak happens, but unlike Chuck who was initially scared, Frank sees dollar signs and begins earning his paycheck, quickly taking depressing photos that get him a little too excited.
Look at that!
He makes it to the bunker and is apprehended by Sullivan, who reminds him and us that Frank is infected.
Now don't take this the wrong way, but ain't you infected?
Oh yeah, forgot about that. And so Dead Rising 2 off the record officially begins. Much like Dead Rising 2, Dead Rising 2 off the record tries to refine the formula we have grown to love over the years. The game came out just over a year after the second game came out, and in that small amount of time, several game mechanics were tweaked to make the experience feel at least a little different, as well as to try and justify that full price charge. Yeah, I'll talk more about that later. They seem to be more like quality of life adjustments, instead of outright changing the entire makeup of the game, like say, the Resident Evil 2 remake for example. Some things have been changed ever so slightly to keep you on your toes. An iconic and often frustrating aspect of Dead Rising 2's gameplay was that Chuck would have to find Zombrex for his daughter Katie, who was infected by her late mother. The ways in which you got this Zombrex were up to you. You could just go buy some from several of the pawn shops around the mall, though at the cost of a lot of money, find hidden Zombrex around Fortune City, or by completing certain side quests that provide Zombrex. It wasn't just a case of finding Zombrex that you had to remember, you also needed to actually get back to the bunker to inject Katie with the Zombrex between 7 and 8 AM. Now Frank doesn't have an ungrateful daughter he has to run around for, so instead he can just inject himself while he's on the go. Though not a massive change from the original sequel, you could say it helps keep the flow of the game going, as you don't need to run back to the safe house every time you need to use Zombrex. I feel like a good trade-off would have been to make Zombrex harder to come by, as this would have added a little bit of pressure to the situation, like running back to the safe house did. Dead Rising 2 by most accounts is an easy game, especially when you compare it to the first one. You don't have to be as locked in, and that's because you have so many more crutches. Survivors are easier to wrangle, survivors have more health, survivors are a lot more competent, and there's a lot more overpowered weapons. Essentially, the challenge of moving survivors from A to B isn't there. Off the Record attempts to balance this issue by making survivors pretty brittle. When grappled, survivors take a lot more damage than they did in Dead Rising 2. This kind of helps balance things out, as Frank can feel a bit overpowered at times, but the checkpoint system kind of negates this, as if a survivor dies or Frank himself dies, you can just reload and try again. This was when Dead Rising started to lose its edge in terms of difficulty. While I love this version of Dead Rising 2, Off the Record definitely holds your hand a lot more than the previous games did. A plus side though to this is that some previously voiceless lines of dialogue are now voice acted, most notably Stacy when telling Frank about scoops, and Frank himself when interacting with certain survivors and reacting to certain events.
Okay, that guy had issues.
It makes the whole game feel a lot more immersive and lines up well with Frank's character.
Talk about you going postal.
Dead Rising 2's narrative is crafted around Chuck. It directly revolves around Chuck. Chuck is pretty much the centre of the game. Chuck. Take a shot every time I say the word Chuck. But Off the Record takes a different approach. Much like Dead Rising 1, Frank is the observer, looking into the story and trying to uncover what's going on. It's a small tweak that helps keep the characters separate, despite both taking part in very similar stories. Chuck's story is very personal. It's basically him versus the world right off the bat, as he has to prove his innocence before the military comes and arrests him. He also feels the brunt of survivors' emotions, as many think he is responsible for the outbreak. Since Frank has no involvement in the events of the story, people see him as the good guy right away. There's no tension between any of them besides him and TK, since they are both the hero and the villain of the story. Well, there is someone else, but I won't spoil that just yet. This type of narrative makes a lot of sense, and not just because Capcom needed to spice things up a little. Frank is an already established hero in this universe. While you could set up Frank to be the villain in the eyes of the survivors, like they did with Chuck, it would be a lot less believable to the player that people would think Frank was now suddenly evil, despite his efforts to save so many people in the first game and uncover the truth of Santa Cabeza. Chuck is more of a nobody, just a bloke who rides motorbikes. Frank is played up like a typical action hero in this game, showing his growth from a cocky journalist into a cocky journalist. When looking at zombie game protagonists, Frank has always stood out. As well as being the OG GOAT, he's just got something about him that's just so entertaining. He's a very unintentionally funny character in the first game, but in this one he's used for a lot of the comic relief, while some of the same dialogue is used for the two characters. A lot of it has been switched to match each one's personality. Chuck is more of a straightforward kind of guy. He's a lot more to the point and emotional. Frank, on the other hand, is just a lot more humorous. Though he's still a likeable hero, he's got a sarcastic edge that gives Off the Record a more light-hearted tone. He has a lot more banter with the psychos and other survivors than Chuck did, and it works so well thanks to TJ Rotolo, almost like he encapsulates the character, and anyone else who tries to do it fails miserably. Oh, that is so strange and weird. A lot of the context around certain characters has also been changed to align with Frank's inclusion. A cool thing in Dead Rising 2 was that certain psychos had personal vendettas against Chuck, because to them, he started the outbreak. People like Brandon, Slappy, and Carl all actively talked to Chuck about his involvement in the outbreak. It gave a lot of depth to these psychos, and actually makes the whole idea of psychos seem more realistic. Most of these guys' lives were ruined by Chuck in their minds, even though it obviously wasn't Chuck. You still feel a bit sorry for them. But Off the Record couldn't use this side of their characters, and instead made them even more unhinged. Carl literally tries to kill you for mail fraud.
That's mail fraud, sir.
Though Dead Rising 2 is far from the most serious game on the market, Off the Record leans more into the comedic side of the series. The events of the story also unfold slightly differently. The big conflict of Dead Rising 2 is Chuck getting framed for the outbreak. This immediately creates tension between the main characters, as they think Chuck is guilty, all the while not knowing that Sullivan was the one behind the whole thing, acting as an agent for Phenotrans. Since Frank is just an innocent bystander, the blame had to fall directly onto Stacy. Since Brandon is the guy who sets the zombies free, Cure are blamed for the whole ordeal, and so the story follows Frank trying trying to uncover the truth to save Stacy, and to reinstate his status as the GOAT. While it's implied that there's a romantic connection between Stacy and Chuck in Dead Rising 2, and off the record Frank has eyes for Rebecca. Their chemistry feels a lot more natural. Since they're both journalists, the idea of them teaming up fits really well, and since both characters use sarcasm and puns more often than not, they feel like they're made for each other. TK and Frank don't initially have beef with each other. This animosity from TK only happens when Frank finds TK and his goons underground, doing some shady shit. Most of the story plays out basically the same. Frank goes looking for Zombrex, Cure get framed, Frank teams up with Rebecca, Sullivan tries to kick Stacy out rather than Chuck and Katie, Brandon is now part of the main story rather than being a side scoop, Frank puts a stop to TK's mercs, stops them from breaking the casinos, and all is well.
Damn it!
This is where the game takes another surprising turn. Much like in the original Dead Rising 2, Rebecca agrees to introduce the protag to her source, but instead of finding Rebecca tied up in the nightclub and fighting Amber and Crystal, Frank goes to meet Rebecca at the Americana Casino restaurant, only to find that she has been kidnapped by TK, who is demanding Frank bring him $1 million to the nightclub in exchange for Rebecca. Sorry love, you're not worth that much to me. Anyone who played the original Dead Rising 2 may think this task is impossible, but fear not, because in Off the Record, money is piss easy to get. Getting money was a mechanic that was already introduced in Dead Rising 2. The player could gamble, smash, and steal money to buy in-game items, like the already mentioned Zombrex. Pawnshops also stored weapons and keys to certain vehicles in the game, though everything was really overpriced. These little bastards just love to rob you. Money was also needed to save certain greedy survivors, but on the flip side, some survivors also rewarded you with cash for saving them or doing a task for them. That being said, getting lots of money was still a difficult and tedious process. Slot machines and ATMs didn't really pay out too well, which I guess was implemented so you couldn't completely break the game with tons of cash. You could earn money in the Terror is Reality online game mode and transfer it to the main game, but let's be real, ain't nobody playing that shit anymore. Since Off the Record included the $1 million for Rebecca scoop, Capcom needed to make money more obtainable, so now big wins are bigger and ATMs give you more loot. Keys can also be collected for money boxes that reward you with money and other goodies like Zombrex. While you could say this is a bit broken, it does allow you to access some of the more unobtainable goodies from Dead Rising 2. After being a complete degenerate, Frank obtains the money and heads to the nightclub, where things pretty much play out the same. You kill one of the crazy bitches, the other one game ends herself, and you save Rebecca once again. Rebecca and Frank intercept the helicopter that TK is trying to escape on. After chucking shit at it, it explodes, and Frank and Rebecca take TK to the safe house. Both of these two world-class journalists go out to see the military arrive, but not before Frank mansplains how to take pictures.
Hey, rookie! You're shooting into the sun! Besides, from my spot, I can already see the military.
The military are shite, Boykin goes mental and kidnaps Rebecca, and 8-Ball once again covers the left flank. Guess some things never change. The game's conclusion is leading to the same place. The safe house gets overrun, TK gets bitten, and Sullivan is being a dick. Classic Sullivan. And Phenotrans are once again behind the attack. The evidence is laid out on the table, Sullivan is acting sus. It seems like everything is aligning. Rebecca picks up the phone and then... oh shit. Stacy turns out to be the spy instead of Sullivan, and she guns down both Rebecca and Sullivan, but the biggest betrayal has to be the fake ponytail. How could you, Stacy? You had such lovely hair. This leans back into what I mentioned previously. Certain characters have had their fates changed to add a bit of flair to this reimagining of the sequel. Stacy's may seem like the biggest character change, but it really isn't, and that's saying something. The person who guides you throughout the game being the main villain, that's some deep shit. But unfortunately for her, she gets outshined by the biggest one in the Dead Rising universe, and that's of course, Otis. As previously mentioned, Brandon plays a much bigger role in the game. Instead of being a side scoop psycho, he's the one responsible for the whole thing. Kind of makes sense when you think about it. In Dead Rising 2, he was all for the zombie uprising until he got bit, so making him the man behind the slaughter is quite poetic. He's not the only character from this side scoop who gets their fate changed. Vicky was a savable survivor in the original sequel, but in Off the Record, she gets straight up murked by Brandon. An infamous psycho from Dead Rising 2 is Leon Bell, a fellow Terror is Reality contestant who holds a grudge towards Chuck, because according to him, Chuck is a pussy. This game also has a slicycle riding mentalist, but it's not Leon Bell.
Hey! You get the hell away from my bike!
It's our poor boy Chuck Green. In this universe, Chuck has been transformed into a psycho after the death of Katie. Overtaken by grief, he slipped into insanity, strapping a plastic doll to his back and imagining it's Katie. It's honestly so sad to see our boy like this, and the voice performance by Peter Fleming is perfect. In Dead Rising 2, Chuck's voice is so calming and stoic, and in that context makes him seem like a badass. But in the context of this game, his voice makes this version of Chuck feel so depressing. He initially seems friendly with Frank, claiming he thought he was one of those crazies, but when Frank grabs Katie, Chuck flips out and tries to kill him. I think what makes this boss fight even worse is that we don't even know what happens to him. Oh well, at least we know his Psycho theme slaps. On a lighter note, the game introduces another killer clown to the Dead Rising universe. Evan is the only Psycho in the game who is a completely brand new character to Off the Record. While there's technically 3 new Psychos in the game, Chuck, Stacy and Evan, the other 2 were previously established characters, while Evan is a completely fresh character exclusive to Off the Record. What's interesting is that Evan is the only Psycho in the game to have a personal connection with Frank.
Wait. Frank West. Frank West. No, I've heard of you.
Much like how Carl, Brandon and Slappy all think Chuck started the outbreak and subsequently fight him, Evan is the brother of the late Adam, who of course Frank kicked the fuck out of. And Evan uses this moment to take his revenge. Another interesting factoid about Evan is that he is a 2-stage boss fight. Getting him to half health causes him to fall off his stilts and reveal his true size.
Oh, Frank West, you're going to try all of my fingers!
Psychos aren't the only new addition to the game. A few brand new survivors have also been added for Frank to save. While it's nice to have a few new faces, none of them really stand out. Except Tamami, she's class. Certain side quests have also been swapped around to keep the game unpredictable. Some scoops will appear at different times to what they did in Dead Rising 2, and also appear in different locations. Speaking of locations, Off the Record introduces a whole new area for you to explore, Uranus Zone. Fortune City is the city of dreams, if you're a gambling degenerate sex addict. Uranus Zone, apart from being a hilarious innuendo, offers up a new playable area for you to explore in the form of an outer space theme park. Though a little out of place compared to all these casinos and massive fuck-off restaurants, Uranus Zone stands out for its unique appearance. Having a theme park in a Dead Rising game seems like a no-brainer, considering how iconic the Space Rider machine was from the first game. This game kind of opens up this concept a bit further, allowing you to use the rides in the park to kill zombies. Dead Rising 2 introduced one of the biggest inclusions in the Dead Rising universe, which was combo weapons. These makeshift weapons have become an iconic staple of all the games after Dead Rising 2, and Off the Record adds a few new ones that align with the new added area. Now you can RP as an alien with laser eyes. The Uranus Zone offers up a wide range of additional entertainment to the game, and is also where the big boss fight of the game takes place.
I'll be in the theme park. You can come play on my ride.
Dead Rising 2 had you fight Sullivan in a very annoying yet emotional one-on-one battle, and in Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, you fight off a fuck-off giant robot. The original shows Chuck as a very tragic and emotional man who has been broken by an outbreak before, and understands how painful they are for anyone involved, and so after he realises why all of these people have died, he loses his head. Frank, on the other hand, seems to have a lot more fun in the situation. While he is still angry with Phenotrans for killing all these people, he acts like it's just another day for him. Frank's also a man who believes in equal rights, which is why he beats the shit out of Stacy and lets her get crushed by her own robots.
Always thought you had a crush on me.
Yeah, couldn't help yourself, could you? The ending that leads you to overtime has you looking for TK. Frank scours the safe house, only to find that both him and Rebecca are gone. Okay, this is a banger. The soundtrack for Off the Record is mostly just the same, but the newer tracks that they did add absolutely slap, except the one they use for looters.
Hey man, check it out.
It's such a goofy beat. Chuck's Psycho theme is pretty great, but Frank's theme from the credits is just chef's kiss, especially to anyone who appreciates Dead Rising like I do. They brought the guys back who made Gone Guru, and they did not disappoint with this track. Don't think there's ever been a song that perfectly encapsulates such a badass and unhinged zombie killer. The song's so powerful you forget there's an overtime mode. Oh shit, yeah, overtime mode. Overtime mode, as expected, plays out pretty much the same way, only this time TK has Rebecca, who isn't dead. Finally, the Dead Rising gods answered my prayers. In this timeline, Stacy shoots Rebecca in the stomach, whereas in the other version, Sullivan shoots her straight in the head. Absolute savage. Besides from the changes in rescuees, nothing else major changes. Oh, actually, now you can hear TK over the radio when he speaks to you. Though nothing innovative, it at least gets you more immersed in your mission to find all his shit. After getting said shit, he once again betrays you, and you have to fight him in a tedious boss fight that causes more stress than is necessary. After beating TK, he attacks Frank one last time.
You are ever gonna.
This is it, Frank. The last time you'll be able to crack wise in this game. You've come so far with some bangers and some cringe moments, but now's your chance to end it all on a high. The stage is yours.
Gonna.
Fall to your death?
Wow, you showed him. Even TK looks disappointed. Frank saves Rebecca and the two head off into the sunset. But that doesn't have to be the end of Frank's time in Fortune City. After all, what's not to like? Why walk away from this gambling simulator with zombies in it when you could stay there forever? Yes, though it may seem like a dream, it's a reality with Sandbox mode. The two previous games both had bonus modes. Dead Rising 1 had Infinite mode, while Dead Rising 2 had Terror is Reality Online. Sandbox mode takes the core elements of Infinite mode. It lasts forever, and there's horrible survivors ready to kill you around every corner. A big difference between the two though is that you don't have to rush around finding food before you starve to death, but instead there are challenges available for you to do. Challenges that range from killing so many zombies in a certain amount of time, to earning so much PP in a certain amount of time, to racing to an objective within a certain amount of time, and to collecting as many massages as you can in a certain amount of time. The challenges are an outlet for letting you do some of the more unique activities available in Dead Rising, and they also reward you with money. Money and PP earned during Sandbox mode can also be crossed over into the main game, and that means you can just sit there for hours spamming slot machines to pretty much buy whatever you want in the story mode. They put a ton of challenges in Sandbox mode, but let's be real, Dead Rising players are too brain rotted for that shit. We just want to kill zombies and gamble. As a game that's been around for years now, the price of it really isn't an issue, and if you've never played the original Dead Rising 2 and went straight to Off the Record, then this game probably felt like a good purchase back in the day. But when you put into context that this game was sold at full price when it was released, then it comes across like a bit of a rip-off. Now don't get me wrong, I'd pay triple that to play a brand new Dead Rising game with the real Frank West at the forefront, but this was still a pretty dickish move from Capcom to repackage a nearly identical game a year later. When you deep it, Capcom tried to implement new things to make the price seem justified, like jump scares, costumes that grant you special abilities, and a stripper. Yeah, back then this game would have been considered a rip-off, but it's still my favourite version of Dead Rising 2. Sure, Chuck's a great guy, but he'll never come close to Frank, and besides, Frank doesn't have a dead wife or a sick daughter, because Frank's a Sigma loner.